Hi, I'm Luisa Leme with ASCOA Online. On October 6, more than 155 million voters in over 5,000 cities in Brazil elected mayors and council members. They say all politics is local, but these races were about more than just voter concerns about their cities.
It should be a discussion about the fair prices. It should be the discussion about public hospitals. It should be a discussion of the kindergartens. I mean, really, what are the responsibilities of the mayors? That's not what happened this time. What happened this time was that basically people in important cities like São Paulo, Porto Alegre, Fortaleza, Recife, it was a discussion about many other things that are basically what we call identities.
That's Thomas Traumann, a journalist and political consultant in Brazil and one of the authors of the book Biography of the Abismo. I'm translating the title from the Portuguese. He spoke to me shortly after the election to help me understand what Brazil's municipal elections say about polarization in Latin America. His book explains that the past presidential elections of 2022 never really ended for Brazilians. Voting and lifestyles continue to fall along these dividing lines. They're based on worldviews and things like gender, what sector you work in, or social issues like gay rights and abortion. Are you a Lulista from the left, or are you a right-wing Bolsonarista? The answer to this question is shaping how Brazilians talk with their families, consume products, or choose their kids' school. So, on one hand, yes, in these municipal elections, center parties flipped a large number of cities. But as Traumann points out, if you look at main capitals and the content of the campaigns, Brazilians continue to be drawn towards extremes, and emotions are running quite high.
If you give a look on what really people are talking about, and if you see specifically in São Paulo, what we saw was enormous discussion on where identity got an extremely point. It was extremely violent campaign. I mean, the mayor debates were so violent that one of the candidates threw a chair on the other one.
Você não é homem?
Não, Datena.
Vai.
Não! Nossos comerciais, por favor.
So what else happened while feelings and chairs were flying through the headlines? We spoke about which political blocs made clear progress across the country and how President Lula and his party could fight extreme right forces. And what these races for Brazilian cities tell us about the 2026 presidential election.
There will be an insurgent, a rogue candidate, and this will probably make a change in the election in 2026.
If you're trying to keep up on Latin America's votes this year, check ASCOA Online Election Guide. That's as.coa.org/2024. You will find all episodes of our special series on elections. We cover Nayib Bukele's global reach, the first woman elected president in Mexico, the upcoming presidential vote in Uruguay, and more. We're going to drop the link on the episode notes. Thanks to our listeners all around the globe, from El Paso to Belo Horizonte to Copenhagen. Write us a review, and if you haven't already, share this episode with another Latin America or election aficionado. Help us spread the word. You know, I expected lots of candidates talking about Lula or Bolsonaro instead of campaign issues, but never thought I would see a chair flying on television during a political debate.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Traumann, thank you for coming back to Latin America in Focus. We spoke during the last elections cycle. I had the privilege to interview you. I also interviewed Felipe Nunes, who is a pollster in Brazil, who wrote a book with you named Biografia do Abismo. The book has no translation in English yet, but draws a picture of polarization in Brazil through the last decades. So since you published this book, we've seen municipal elections in Brazil. Do we see the same divisions in terms of geography, of demographics that we saw in 2022?
Luisa, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Yes and no, obviously, as always in this question. Yes, in the sense that basically, for instance, the PT, the Workers' Parties, that is Lula's parties, got lower numbers than they did in the election with Lula, but a little bit better than what they had in the local elections in 2020. But if we give a look on the geography, basically the PT had a well and a better, let's say, performance in the Northeast, that is basically where Lula always wins, and the PL, the Partido Liberal, the PL, who is the party of Bolsonaro, had a much better and a really good performance in the South and the Center-West. That is basically where Bolsonaro is stronger. So we can already see that this geographic division of Brazil, where basically Northeast votes for the left, and the Center-West and the South votes for the right, and the election is in the swing states, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, and the city of São Paulo is has repeated himself again in 2020. In important cities like São Paulo, Porto Alegre, Fortaleza, Recife, it was a discussion about many other things that are basically what we call identities. We can see what was the identity, for instance, of the entrepreneurs. I mean, people who are working themselves up, Uber drivers or taxi drivers, or have small business and have to lift themselves up, and they don't need the government, or they just want the government not to spoil their day. Or, for instance, people were about the amnesty of the people who are in jail today for trying the coup in January 8 in Brazil. Or, I mean, many other changings that are not really, let's say, municipal discussions. And I think this just gives us a glimpse of what and how polarized Brazil is, and how bad this will be in 2026, when President Lula will probably run again for his fourth mandate, and probably with a very strong opposition against him. We will see this replay of what we saw in 2022.
Some analysts in the press in Brazil and observers outside as well said that for those municipal races, polarization did not play that big of a role as expected. And reading your book as the campaign unfolded, I almost felt that some events from the São Paulo campaign, for example, were almost previously described in a book. More political violence and the identity politics, as you were explaining. Can you explain how this polarization set evolved? Like, why are people saying that it wasn't exactly what was expected?
I think it's wishful thinking. I'm sorry. The fact is that obviously some center parties had a very good performance. For instance, PSD and MDB got, if you see only the numbers, the straight numbers, PSD got almost 900 cities, and the MDB got 800 and some cities. So I mean, you could see, okay, the center parties got extremely powerful. But if you give a look on what really people are talking about, and if you see specifically in São Paulo, what we saw was enormous discussion on where identity got an extremely point, where we had, as you said, was extremely violent campaign. I mean, the mayor debates were so violent that one of the candidates threw a chair on the other one.
Yeah.
Then they had to have fixed chairs on the elections, and people had to pass through metal gates in the debate, because they were afraid that somebody could have a gun.
There were metal detectors on the debates?
Exactly.
Wow.
If this is not polarization, well, I don't know what it is.
Right. You started talking about São Paulo already. The race started, as you said, as the perfect picture of this dichotomy between Lula and Bolsonaro. And then we had a surprise element. Pablo Marçal, a digital influencer who had no time for TV political campaigns, as his party has no seats in Congress, but had millions of digital followers, of social media followers. He created a lot of turmoil along the campaign, as you were explaining. He was the one who received a chair on his head on live television. And also, one of the people in his team had a fist fight in another debate. Marcel kind of stole the show, and then he stole over 1 million votes.
1,700,000, Luisa.
And he didn't make the runoff by what, 1 percentage point, right?
80,000 votes.
So is Marcel the new version of the outsider here, Traumann? How do you see him in this race? He did not get formal support from Bolsonaro, just explaining this to our listeners. How do you see him in this race and in the context of polarization?
Yeah, I think one of the main lessons of this election was that there's no doubt that the opposition won the election. I mean, it was basically a vote on the opposition parties. But the point is the opposition is split. And it's split because, let's say, that the traditional right that I think we could represent on São Paulo Governor Tarcísio de Freitas, it's not strong enough to lead the radical right that is now represented by Pablo Marçal. And this was not only in São Paulo. This also, I mean, the right against right also happened in Curitiba. It also happened in Fortaleza. It also happened in many other important capitals in Brazil, state capitals in Brazil. Because one, the right got really enormous in Brazil. And two, the idea, I mean, the anti-establishment feeling of a part of Brazilian voters, it has not gone. So in a sense, what Pablo Marçal is, Pablo Marçal, he looks like Bukele from El Salvador. I mean, they look alike.
He went to El Salvador, right, before the campaign.
He tried to have a chat with President Bukele, but was dismissed. He tried to have a chat with Javier Milei in Argentina, and also was dismissed by Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro asked Milei not to receive him. But it just goes to show what are his connections and what are his idols, his role models. I mean, he is a little bit of Bukele in the sense that he is extremely digital and thinks of himself as a cool leader. I mean, he says the most outrageous things the same way Javier Milei says against his opponents. And he has a sense of what was Bolsonaro in 2018 when he got elected. But he doesn't have, let's say, the military part that Bolsonaro has once Bolsonaro was a former captain of the army. What he says is extremely anti-left, anti the system. He accuses his opponents of anything he can with no proofs. I mean, he sees everything is valid to win. And he tries to represent somebody who is not represented. I mean, somebody who is not in a union, somebody who doesn't have a contract or has a legal job. He's talking to people who are, let's say, in the margin of the society. And he is a self-made man. He also was from a poor family, and he became a millionaire. His fortune is something like $50 million. And basically, a guru. He sells courses in the internet, and he says, you can be like me if you just wake up early and work enough. And if you love your wife and you never cheat her and you go to church, and even very, very important thing, he's not a churchgoer in the traditional sense. He is very religious. He talks about Christian values, but he doesn't have a church.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so many evangelical leaders in Brazil feel him as a threat because he says, the same way you have a connection, a direct connection with me during just using your iPhone, you can have a direct connection with God without passing through the churches. No doubt he was a disruptive candidate. And I feel this will make a difference in the next presidential election. Not a question that if Pablo Marçal will be the candidate of this anti-establishment vote in Brazil. There will be a Pablo Marçal. Somebody will be this candidate, anti-establishment candidate, and it will be somebody who will have 10 to 15% of the votes.
Okay.
So will be a change when we draw the election in 2026. A few months ago, we were saying, well, it would be Lula against Tarcísio. And now we will say, well, it's Lula, Tarcísio, and Marçal. There will be an insurgent, a rogue candidate, and this will probably make a change in the election in 2026.
Oh, how interesting. And Traumann, meanwhile, we have something that we call the Centrão as the big winners, as you were putting down, the PSD. If we want to personify this, we can talk about Gilberto Kassab. He's another character in the story, right, in the cycle. And you said, right after the elections, and on Monday morning, you said the race for the 2026 presidential election starts now. Can you explain what will be the role of this middle of aisle, the Centrão, this political bloc in Brazil that has been historically so much about pork and barrel from now on?
Yeah, there's a joke in Brasilia. It says only two things can be everywhere at the same time. One is God, and the other thing is Gilberto Kassab.
That's great.
Because Gilberto Kassab, he appointed 3 of the ministers of the Lula administration. At the same time, he helped elect the president of the Senate.
Okay.
At the same time, he is the main political advisor of the leader of the opposition, Tarcísio de Freitas. I mean, how can you be...
How can you be so many things at the same time in a polarized world?
Exactly. That's why, exactly. Only God and Gilberto Kassab can be everywhere. So the Centrão, they can be everywhere. And they will be in the next government, whoever it is, will need to have this big center together with them. But one thing is very important is a comparison to other countries. It's very difficult to be re-elected in Brazil.
Okay.
And normally, there's around 2/3, a little bit less than 2/3 of the mayors can get re-elected. 60%, 58%, depending on election. This time, last Sunday, we had 82% of elections in Brazil. This is a record from any other election since, I don't know, the 80s or the 70s probably.
Big difference.
Big difference. And why is that happen? Basically because in the last 6 years, Congress grabbed a part of the power of the executive branch on distributing part of the budget. Just making a long story short, today 50 billion reais, that's something around a little bit less than $10 billion, is distributed to the cities by the Congress. And that means that any representative, let's say from Paraná, can send 100 million reais to his mayor, so the mayor gets reelected, and then the mayor helps him to get reelected in spare money, money it's not obliged to spend, that Lula government is free to spend, is around 200 billion. So I mean that's a lot, just so our listeners have an idea. So that means that Congress won the election last Sunday, more than the center, more than Congress, because it shows how effective was this orçamento secreto, or the using of parliamentary amendments. And what's the next step? Well, in February, we will have the election for the Speaker of the House and President of the Senate. So the importance of this election, that normally is an election that nobody really looks very closely, is enormous, no? Because who has the power to decide if so-and-so will have 100 million or will have 10 million is the President of the House.
You make me think about another, let's say, supporting actor on this whole story, who is also a young man from the right wing, Nicolas Ferreira, who is a deputado who ran the country campaigning to elect right-wing candidates. And looks to me, Traumann, that the right is more organized, making better use of the internet. And then we can't talk about Congress without thinking how much the federal government needs Congress, how much President Lula really needs Congress to approve things. What would be Lula's and the Workers' Party's main lesson here with this more powerful Congress? What is their big lesson for the next couple of years for 2026?
Yeah, it's good you mentioned Nicolas Ferreira. Nicolas Ferreira was one of the presidents who supported Pablo Marçal, even defying Jair Bolsonaro. And I feel Nicolas Ferreira could be a presidential candidate if he wasn't that young. He's only 28.
Yeah, he cannot by law be a presidential candidate, right?
Can only be candidate in Brazil with 35. But if he was 35, no doubt I would put Nicolas Ferreira as a presidential candidate. And he represents a lot of this anti-establishment idea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're on the target on this. Somebody to look after in the next years is this young representative from Minas Gerais. And I think that Lula understands exactly that how Congress has got so powerful. And this is one of the reasons Lula got hands off of this election.
Mm.
I mean, he made some videos for some candidates, and he went to 3 rallies during the entire campaign.
Oh, wow.
All 3 in São Paulo. Made some videos for Fortaleza or Recife, but I mean, very light. And why he did that? Because he knows how important this is for Congress and how, I mean, the effect that the local elections have on representatives and senators. He doesn't want to fight. If we talk about organization, during this election, many people from the right appeared. I mean, and we're making tours around the country to help the rightist candidates. And this was not only Bolsonaro, but was his wife, Michele Bolsonaro, was there all the sons. It was Pablo Marçal, it was Nicolas Ferreira, you mentioned. And from the left, there was no one.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the left, no doubt, is not only Lula dependent at one point, but also, I mean, nobody's showing up. I mean, there will be a true problem for the PT and from the left when Lula leaves office. And just so our people remember, Lula is 79 today.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a young fellow who has a bright future for him. I mean, he's probably has, the next election will be probably his last election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like let's say the young man that we could hope for to take the reins, let's say, is the candidate that went to the second round in São Paulo, but he's not perceived like that, right? Guilherme Boulos is going to the second round. I don't believe he's a favorite considering the polls. What do these results that we've seen this month say about Lula's presidency and say about the race for 2026 for the Workers' Party?
When obviously talking in 2 years, it's very hard. But I mean, no doubt, I'm quite sure if Lula or somebody else runs from the left, it will start basis with 45%, and the anti-Lula will also have 45%, and they will dispute the last 10% in the election. So this is done. This is how polarized Brazil is.
Okay.
But having that said, I feel there is a difficulty in understanding the Lula phenomenon even for the left. And this is a part of a chapter on the book Biografia do Abismo that Felipe Nunes and I wrote. That is when we made, I don't know, hundreds of focus groups to understand who was voting for Lula and who was voting for Bolsonaro. And when we got to Lula, obviously there is a part that is, let's say, petistas. There are other people who are hard left and understand and are party people, and I mean, this is one part of the group. And then a very important part are what we call the progressive electors, who are people who voted for Lula basically because of the women's agenda, who voted for Lula because of the GLBT plus agenda, who voted for environmental issues. I mean, worries of, let's say, the 21st century.
Right.
And then there is the most part of it is the people who are just poor. And they voted for Lula because they see themselves in Lula. They identify themselves with Lula. And they identify themselves on the public policies that the Lula's government have done in the two first and also in this one. They are not progressive. They are not from the left. They are Lula.
Eu não pararei porque eu não sou mais ser humano. Eu sou uma ideia.
It's not just about cash transfer programs. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. It's about identity. And I would like to talk about one candidate that really interests me from São Paulo, who is very smart and very talented and try to make a center, trying to be from the center. I'm not from the left, I'm not from right, I'm from the center. Her name is Tabata Amaral. And she ran a very decent campaign. She was extremely attacked by misogynist attack from all other candidates. She suffered a horrible attacks from Pablo Marçal in the beginning. And she made a very good campaign, you know. I mean, everything was right. Technically speaking, she did everything that she must have done. And in the end, she only had 9%. Obviously, if she got to the second race, she no doubt she would win anyone because she was a broader candidate. She would have more votes, and I mean, she could make, let's say, a bridge from center right to center left. Okay. But she never gets a chance because the left has just strictly 30% of the votes in São Paulo. The right, as we can now see, has more, probably has 45% of the votes in São Paulo at least. And they just squeeze her, you know? And I feel that this has become, I mean, the way that it will happen in Brazil. If somebody from the center tried to be candidate in Brazil, okay, good luck, you will have 5% of the votes. End of story. No,
not much chance here.
No, not much chance. And I feel that's the same way that somebody trying to be independent party in the US.
You know, you close the book talking about how this polarization, it's really stiff. It's really hard to crack. And from what you're saying now, the municipal elections show that. I want to ask you about solutions. What is the light you see in the end of the process? You talk in the book too about leaders after winning the race, uniting the country, uniting their voters around common issues. And then to bring this to Latin America, you know, security, it's a concern in lots of countries. Even in Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum was elected and a massive win. Her first #1 lesson to address from voters, considering the polls, is security. Is that how we go from here? Is that how we overcome polarization, Traumann? And I'm putting you in the spot because how are you going to know? It's going to be hard.
Yeah, it's very hard, and very hard question. I'll try to answer it. I think that coming back to, I mean, the common grounds, I think that Lula started very well right after January 8 in Brazil, when he went together with all the ministers from the judges from the Supreme Court and with the Speaker of the House and with the President of the Senate, watching all the destruction that was done. And I think this was, let's say, a special moment. And I'm afraid this moment was lost during the process.
It was a walk for democracy. Even the people who don't belong to the left, who united behind Lula during the election, joined him, right?
Essas autoridades cruzando agora a Praça dos Três Poderes, indo até a sede do Supremo Tribunal Federal.
Exactly. But I think Lula lost it during the process. I think one of the main difference between Lula 3 and Lula 1 and 2 was that the people who have worked with Lula in his first two governments, they all said how Lula was always talking, having dinners or traveling the country and receiving big businessmen and receiving people who disliked him. I mean, and this was Lula. And the Lula that we are seeing today, for many reasons, probably he's older, probably he has less patience, probably after, we cannot forget, he got over 2 years in jail. He receives less people, he has more truth in what he feels is right and what he will do. I think he lost the chance of the Frente Ampla. I mean, he could at that moment make a big Frente Ampla, but if you see, I mean, if you just look at his agenda, Even the vice president, Geraldo Alckmin, who was his opponent during the beginning of the century, he talks to Alckmin, he likes Alckmin, but he doesn't listen to Alckmin. I mean, just to give one example.
You're the writer of another book, the toughest job in the world. I think that would be the translation. That it's about the Ministry of the Economy in Brazil, and you, who also have experience working in the cabinet, understands this, right? As much as he's close, you think it will be harder for him to find this common issue. Is that what you're trying to say?
Exactly. And I feel this is the one thing that he needs to change if he wants to win the next election. If he wants to have because coming back to what I said before about 45% pro-Lula, 45% anti-Lula, this 10%, we are talking of people who voted for Bolsonaro in 2018 and then got disgusted by the election, by the Bolsonaro government, and voted for Lula in 2022. But they are not Lulistas and nor Bolsonaristas. I mean, they are fluid. They may change. And I feel that the way Lula is running this government, he's losing this swing voters, basically because this is not a leftist government in the sense it's not doing really the leftist agenda, but it's a government with a leftist speech. There's no doubt about that. The speech is left. Now, even if the acts are not really from
or let's
left,
say progressive, right?
Progressive, exactly. When we talk about what he's doing in the economy, what he's doing in common, I mean, his policies, the public policies of Lula's government, not from the left, it's center-left, social democrat, normal policy. But he has lost the chance of making this bridge to the center. And I think this will be extremely important for the next 2 years. And not only for Lula, but also for the survival of the Workers' Party once Lula is retired.
We got to a very good what Lula needs to do, but not how we get over polarization.
No, because it's so difficult. And I feel that there's a joke, Felipe and I, we always say that we just look to the US and say, well, in 2 years, this will happen in Brazil. And this was with Trump, then came Bolsonaro. This was with January 6th, and then came January 8th. This was the victory of Biden, and it was Lula. So we are just watching you and saying, well, in 2 years, we'll see what will happen in Brazil.
We'll see what's going to happen later. Thomas Traumann, thank you so much for coming back to Latin American Focus. I think you gave so much for us to think about that. We will have you again in the next 2 years for sure. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was always a pleasure to talk to you, Luisa.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Luisa Leme. This episode was produced by me and our associate producers, Fabrício Ricaldi and Kalia Robertson. If you like this conversation and you listen until here, you should check past episodes in our election series and other content on Latin American elections through our guide at as-coa.org/2024. You can also check the podcast notes for the past episodes on Brazil's presidential elections. The music in this podcast is performed by Tigana Santana for America Society. You can watch his entire concert and other artists on our YouTube channel. Find out about upcoming concerts happening here in New York at musicoftheamericas.org. Access other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast or write us an email telling what you think at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members.